This is the man they called the Quiet Beetle, George Harrison. As the Beatles exploded across the world in the early 1960s, he found himself increasingly isolated, not just from the rest of the world due to his extraordinary fame, but also from the rest of his bandmates. Today I want to tell you the true story about how he found his soul brother in one of the few other men on the planet who could have truly appreciated what it was he was experiencing. A man who would become a friend for the rest of his life, fellow songsmith Bob Dylan. When the Beatles formed in the late 1950s, a tight, friendly but competitive bond grew up between Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Both knew that in the other one they had found their songwriting partner, their equal and their rival. Guitarist George Harrison, however, was not quite part of that inner circle. He was 3 years younger than band leader John Lennon, and that's a massive gap when you're a teenager. And George had not yet started writing songs. In 1962, the Beatles got signed to EMI Records, and in 1963, as they hit the big time, their fanatical fan base turned into a national frenzy as people lined the streets, chased them wherever they went, and broke down screaming and crying at their concerts. Beatlemania broke out in the UK, and apparently the adulation was so completely wild and insane that seating at venues would frequently be soaked with urine after their performances, during which teenage girls had screamed, wept, and worked themselves up into some kind of insane, borderline religious meltdown. The chaos very quickly spread to the United States the next year, 1964, where, when they landed at JFK Airport, they were mobbed by thousands of fans. Their cars and hotels were permanently surrounded by fans. They performed on the Ed Sullivan Show to approximately 2/5 of the entire population of the USA. And during that first 6 months of 1964, the Beatles' first American album went to number 1. It held that spot for 11 weeks. And the Beatles also simultaneously held number 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 on the American Singles Chart. They had gone in 16 months from virtual unknowns to the dominant pop cultural force on the entire planet. From total obscurity to a level of fan worship that has literally never been matched by anyone else ever since, and all while still in their early 20s. And while it must have been incredible to be a Beatle, there was definitely a flip side to that coin, because their experiences were pretty much totally unique. There was almost no one else in the world who could even slightly relate to anything they were experiencing.
We do like the fans and enjoy reading the publicity about us, but from time to time you don't realise that it's actually about yourself. You see your pictures and read articles about George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Paul and John, but you don't actually think, oh, that's me that I am in the paper. It's funny, it's just as though it's a different person.
You know, people are so in awe of fame. I mean, all you have to do is go on the radio or the television once, and if somebody sees you on there and then they see you down the street, they act different, don't they? But the Beatles have been on the papers every day for a year or so. Everybody changes, you know, they're so impressed by it, and people forget how to act normal.
But of course, no matter how isolated from normal society their fame was making them, George made the point that at least the four of them had each other.
We were always kind of a little nervous before each step we went up the ladder. We were a little nervous, but we always had that confidence. And that was a good thing about being four together, not like Elvis, you know. I always felt sorry later for Elvis because he was on his own. He had his guys with him, but there was only one Elvis. Nobody else knew what he felt like. But for us, we all shared the experience.
They weren't completely alone in their experiences, because at least the other Beatles knew how it felt. And yet, within that tiny social circle of just the four Beatles, there was still, nonetheless, a bit of a hierarchy. Lennon was the band leader, but Lennon and McCartney were nonetheless pretty dominant, both being strong, assertive personalities and prodigiously talented and ever-improving songwriters. George, however, was the quiet Beatle. He was not part of that songwriting world, And when he looked back, he also made the point that he was never invited in either.
Paul had asked, had suggested maybe the chance of me and he writing together something. And, it's pretty funny, really, because, I've only been there about 30 years in Paul's life, and it's like now he wants to write with me.
George wrote his first original song for the Beatles on their second UK album with the Beatles. It was a song called Don't Bother Me. It is a good reflection of his quieter, more reclusive personality. And while that song, it's okay, it's nonetheless clear listening to it that at that point, George had a long road ahead of him if he was ever going to catch up with Lennon and McCartney. 1 month before they landed in America, the Beatles had been staying at the Olympia Hotel in Paris, and Paul McCartney came in with a copy of this, the freewheeling Bob Dylan. The Beatles listened to it over and over, and George described it as the highlight of that trip. Looking back, it's amazing to see how people's futures turn on some tiny little seemingly insignificant moment. But Paul walking into that shop in Paris and buying that album turned out to be a turning point in the life of George Harrison, one that would send out ripples through the years that would turn out to be life-changing. The Beatles were listening to him, and it turned out he was also listening to the Beatles. Because he'd heard their US #1 hit, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and he'd misheard the line, It's such a feeling that my love I can't hide, thinking that they were actually singing, I Get High. Although they didn't meet in February of that year, when the Beatles were in the States in August, Bob Dylan and the Fab Four met for the first time. Dylan was particularly keen on meeting Lennon, the writer, artist, intellectual of the group. But the deepest and longest lasting bond begun that night was with George Harrison. Their two reclusive personalities meshed. Many view that meeting as being a profound turning point for both the Beatles and for Dylan, as Bob integrated a Beatles-like use of rock and roll into his music, and the Beatles began to write lyrics that had the depth and seriousness of Dylan songs. But perhaps the biggest turning point that came about as a result of their meeting was that Bob introduced the band to marijuana. They all got outrageously stoned together in that hotel room, and afterwards the Beatles' use of weed got to the point that, to quote Lennon, they were literally smoking it for breakfast. Famously, during the making of the Help film, the whole band were completely stoned for multiple scenes and unable to stop giggling. But pot wasn't the only significant change that had now started to happen in the Beatles, because on the Help album, George Harrison, at last, contributed 2 more original songs. These were I Need You and You Like Me Too Much. At last, as a songwriter, he was starting to flourish. The following year, they made their first pot album, Rubber Soul, and by the time of their next album, Revolver, which came out in 1966, George's songwriting had got so good that it was one of his songs, Taxman, that now opened the album. As a songwriter, he'd found his momentum and at last was gaining ground. But now let's cut back to Bob, because in 1966 all was not well with the Crown Prince of Folk. The same year the Beatles had released Revolver, 1966, Dylan released his double album, Blonde on Blonde, frequently voted one of the greatest albums of all time. But he was exhausted, burned out and under pressure. Following meeting the Beatles, he had begun playing with a full electric band, and the audience reaction from the folk purists had been sometimes pretty aggressive. In June 1966, he returned from a 9-month world tour made especially gruelling by the relentless hostility with which audiences had met his new sound. And though he was exhausted, embittered and thoroughly road-weary, his aggressive manager, Albert Grossman, had booked him into a 64-date American tour due to start in August. He'd also been given 2 weeks to finish his novel, Tarantula, and was under pressure to put together all the footage of his recent world tour for a documentary. He was not in a good place mentally, and a few weeks later he ended up having a motorbike accident in which he broke several vertebrae in his neck. Having felt under immense pressure and having struggled with excessive drug use while on tour, Dylan took the chance to take a step back and recover from his injuries, also as an opportunity to withdraw from public life for a while. This was the start of what he described as his amnesia period, in which he had a kind of writer's block and focused on painting instead of songwriting. He said in a 1984 interview, "When I had that motorcycle accident, I woke up and caught my senses. I realised I was just working for all these leeches, and I really didn't want to do that." Bob stepped back from public life and stopped touring for almost 8 years. And in a strange parallel, just 1 month later, after a gig at San Francisco's Candlestick Park, the Beatles too made the decision to permanently stop touring and transition over to being a studio-only band. Just as all was not well with Bob, all was not well in the Beatles camp either. As they started work on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, George had noticed a shift of dynamic within the band. Whereas once he'd been able to say that the four of them had each other, now that camaraderie was falling apart. Now they were starting to drift away and lose each other.
The funny position I was in was that in many ways, this whole focus of attention was on the Beatles, so in that respect I was part of it. But from being in them, an attitude came over, which was John and Paul. Okay, were the grooves, and you two, just watch it. I mean, don't forget I spent 10 years in the back of the limousine with them.
George contributed only one song to Sgt. Pepper's, Within You Without You. He did submit another tune called Only a Northern Song, which seemed to be written about how his songs always got rejected for Beatles albums. In a predictably ironic twist, that song was also rejected for Sgt. Pepper's. At this time, George had also begun to grow deeply religious, and so was kind of losing his focus and his interest in the Beatles.
For me, it was kind of a bit tiring, or it was a bit boring, because, I had a few moments in there that I enjoyed, but generally I didn't really like that album much. My heart was still in India, that was the big thing for me when that happened in the 66. After that, everything else seemed like hard work, it was a job. It was like doing something I didn't really want to do. I was losing interest in being fab at that point.
Of all the Beatles, George seemed to be the one who liked Sgt. Pepper's the least. And, interestingly, another person who was not particularly impressed with the album was Bob Dylan, who said he didn't like it and that it was indulgent and overproduced. Looking back on the fractures that were starting to grow up within the Beatles, Bob Dylan said this of George.
George got stuck with being the Beatle that had to fight to get songs on records because of Lennon and McCartney. Well, who wouldn't get stuck? If George had had his own group and was writing his own songs back then, he'd have been probably just as big as anybody.
And this was, understandably, even more frustrating to George, because even though you might not be able to tell by listening to Sgt. Pepper's, at this point, he was becoming a serious songwriter. After Sgt. Pepper's, as the Beatles moved on to make the White Album, things just got worse and worse for George. By this point, he was easily as good as Paul and John. He was nipping at their heels as a songwriter, but he was still, nonetheless, being treated as inferior, as the less talented third wheel. An interview with George from Crawdaddy magazine in 1977 shows just how bad things had got within the band by the White Album. George says, "None of us really thought about leaving until 67 or 68, which was after we stopped touring. I know the first time for me, which was the most depressing, was during the White Album. The problem was that John and Paul had written songs for so long it was difficult. First of all, because they had such a lot of tunes and they automatically thought that theirs should be priority. So for me, I'd always have to wait through 10 of their songs before they'd even listen to one of mine. I had a little encouragement from time to time, but it was very little. It was like they were doing me a favour. I didn't have much confidence in writing songs because of that, because they never said, yeah, that's a good song. When we got into things like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, We recorded it one night and there was such a lack of enthusiasm. So I went home really disappointed because I knew the song was good. His wife Patty said he was unhappy. The Beatles made him unhappy with the constant arguments and rows. They could be vicious to each other. That was all really upsetting. He would come home from recording or seeing them and just be full of anger, and then he would be cross with himself. It was a very bad state that he was in. By the time of the making of the White Album, George had lost that once precious connection with the band. They had gone, in his eyes, from being the only other people who understood to his oppressors. In October 1968, partially as an attempt to just get away from it all, George went to LA in America to produce Is This What You Want by Jackie Lomax. While he was there, he and Patty were invited by Bob Dylan's band, The Band, to go and spend the American holiday Thanksgiving with them up in Woodstock, and he and Patty accepted. George both loved and admired Bob Dylan, and at this time in his life, when he'd lost companionship within the band, it must have been such a welcome relief to have a chance to connect with one of the few remaining people on planet Earth who could empathise. George arrived at Bob's house for Thanksgiving at the end of November 1968, but when he got there, something was wrong. There was an unexplained distance between them. George, whose confidence had been battered and bruised, arrived at Woodstock to find Bob Dylan once again, strangely, in an exactly parallel place. In autobiography I Me Mine, George says this: Bob Dylan had gone through the thing of breaking his neck in a motorcycle accident and being out of commission for a time. I was hanging out at his house with him, Sarah and his kids. He seemed very nervous and I felt a little uncomfortable. It seemed strange, especially as he was in his own home. And I was really a bit paranoid musically. I was with Bob and he was being very quiet and he didn't have much confidence anyhow. That's the feeling I got with him in Woodstock. He hardly said a word for a couple of days. I believe George had gone to Woodstock for Thanksgiving that year in the hopes of finding someone he could connect with, someone he could relate to. But when he got there, having escaped all the ego back in London, what he actually found was a Bob Dylan with all the barriers of protection up. And I also think that this was a turning point in the life of George Harrison. A sense of defiance had been growing in him. He wasn't going to be the quiet beetle forever. And the previously passive George made the decision to step up at last from out of the shadows and take the lead. He wasn't going to let Dylan hide away. He was going to coax him out. George said, on about the third day, we got the guitars out and then things loosened up. And I was saying to him, write me some words. And he was saying, show me some chords. How do you get those tunes? It was really a nice time with all his kids around and we were just playing. He sang me a song and he was very nervous and shy and he said, what do you think about this? I'd felt very strongly about Bob when I'd been in India years before. The only record I took with me along with all my Indian records was Blonde on Blonde. I felt somehow very close to him because he was so great, so heavy and so observant about everything. And yet I found him later very nervous and with no confidence. George, having finally managed to bring the defences down just a bit by getting out the guitars, then started writing a song with Bob. And as they jammed together, George began writing down lyrics directly from him to Bob as a plea and an invite for him to bring the walls down properly and to let George in. And here are the lyrics that George wrote. Let me in here. I know I've been here. Let me into your heart. Let me know you. Let me show you. Let me roll it to you. Let me say it. Let me play it. Let me lay it on you. Let me know you. Let me show you. Let me grow upon you. Let me in here. I know I've been here. Let me into your heart. I love those lyrics and I love the story behind those lyrics because it's George Harrison, formerly quiet and passive, stepping up to the plate and literally finding a way to crowbar open the heart of one of the most reclusive and reluctant figures in the world of rock and pop. I think, given the context, it's impossible that Bob could have missed that George was writing directly to him. Harrison then asked Bob to write something too, saying, "Come on, write me some words." And so Bob began scribbling words down. And what Bob wrote was a response to what George had written. And when you realise the context, I find the chorus to this song so moving, because this is Bob saying, "I know I'm a bit unusual, I know my ways are a little withdrawn and strange, but I love you like a brother too." And here are those lyrics, read by George himself.
Yeah, and then what he wrote is so simple. All I have is yours, all you see is mine, and I'm glad to hold you in my arms. I'd have you anytime.
And that's what this song is. It's a kind of brotherly love song from one discouraged, isolated man to another. And it seems, despite Bob's occasional reclusiveness, that from this point on, the two of them remained fast friends for the rest of their lives. We know this song was really special to George because in that Crawdaddy interview, he pointed out "I'd Have You Anytime" as his favourite on the album. But the meaning behind the song is not the only extraordinary thing about it. Bob Dylan contributed the chorus lyrics, but everything else, the music included, was George. And on screen now you can see the chord sequence. If you're not a trained musician, let me tell you, this is seriously advanced stuff. It's packed with key changes. The song opens in G, then shifts into the key of B flat, before reverting back to G again. Then in the choruses we have a sudden key change into A, then a switch to the key of C, then D, then F, then it moves back to G again in the verses. And now look at the timings. This song is not in 4/4, it moves freely through bars of 4/4, 7/8, 9/8 and 6/8. The key changes and rhythmic changes are both utterly brilliant and somehow so natural and intuitive that you hardly notice them. In this song, George effortlessly integrates some of the most complex songwriting techniques without being clunky, but rather with finesse, almost subliminally, with all the hallmarks of an absolute songwriting master craftsman. Perhaps the biggest change that came over George after that Thanksgiving, however, was having seen how Bob did it, he realised that he too could go solo, which of course, within a few years, he did. Like Dylan, George was beginning to see that his next step needed to be away from everything he had done up to that moment. Watching Dylan over Thanksgiving showed George how happy someone could be following his own direction and making his own rules. And by the time this song finally came out after the Beatles had split, the opening track on George's first solo album, what a journey George had travelled. The quiet beetle finally had a voice and had become an assertive leader in his own right. He was no longer trapped, alone, isolated in an ivory tower at the top of the world. Now he had a brother. And his songwriting skill had now reached unbelievable heights. This song in particular being able to hold its own, in my opinion, against literally any song Lennon or McCartney ever composed. Despite occasional periods of quiet, Bob and George remained firm friends for life. They would go on to work together in the supergroup The Travelling Wilburys, where Tom Petty said that Harrison had an ability to talk and relate to Bob that no one else quite had. And despite his reluctance to talk about his private life, Bob himself confirmed that George Harrison meant a lot to him.
How close were you to him? Very close, right?
Yeah.
It's a funny old thing as a bloke, trying to find a way to tell a mate that they matter to you or that you care for them. Every friendship is different, but when we do find a way to get on one another's wavelength and extend the hand of genuine brotherly love, it's amazing how those mates can be the ones who stay with you, literally, for the rest of your life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, I'll see you next time. And as always, a massive thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. And if you would like access to exclusive bonus material and to get credited at the end of videos, the link is down in the description. And hopefully, I'll see you inside.